Imagine a river, flowing red with blood and black with the ink of humanity's greatest books. Imagine an empire that rolls kings into carpets and tramples them with horses so as not to spill noble blood. This is not a horror movie. This is the 13th century, and the world stands on the brink of destruction. The Mongol death machine has already ground Baghdad to dust and is looking west. It seemed there was no salvation, but in this video, you will see how the fate of an entire civilization was decided not by kings or saints, but by former slaves. Men bought in markets like cattle to be forged into perfect killers. You will learn the story of a man who achieved the impossible. He stopped the apocalypse, but the price of that victory will make you shudder. Why did the savior of the world stab his best friend in the back immediately after his triumph? How did the most cunning military trap in history turn hunters into prey in a single instant? And what twisted irony of fate led a great sultan who survived hundreds of battles to die not by the sword of an enemy, but by his own treachery and a sip of a poisoned drink? This is a story of betrayal, brilliant tactics, paranoia, and how yesterday's slave became the most powerful and lonely man on earth. Watch until the end to find out why, even centuries later, he is called both a hero and a monster. Imagine a sound that vibrates not your eardrums, but your very bones. It is not thunder. It is not an earthquake. It is the rhythmic, monotonous drone of hundreds of thousands of hooves pounding the history of civilization into the dust. You are standing on the walls of Baghdad. Below you is the pearl of the world, a city holding millennia of knowledge. And before you, stretching to the horizon, lies a living sea of iron, leather, and pure distilled hatred. You are looking into the eyes of your own death, and it does not blink.
By the end of the year 1257, the air in the east smelled not of spices, but of burning. The world knew war. The world knew cruelty. But what crawled out of the eastern steppes was not an army in the traditional sense. It was a natural disaster. Locusts the size of men, armed with composite bows, striking from 300 meters without missing. The Mongol war machine. An engineering masterpiece of destruction that knew no pity, fatigue, or malfunction. They had one goal: absolute submission, or absolute annihilation. There was no third option. Look at a map of that time. It is burning. The Khwarezmian Empire, ground into powder. The Russian principalities, lying in ruins under snow and ash. The assassins in their impregnable mountain fortresses wipe out to the root. Now Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, looks at Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual center of the Islamic world. Caliph al-Mustazim was a man who believed in fairy tales. He believed walls would save him, that the entire Muslim world would rise at his call, that angels would descend from the heavens and stop the pagans. What monstrous, criminal naivety. While the caliph counted gold in his treasury and listened to flattering viziers, Mongol engineers were already chopping down palm groves, assembling siege engines, catapults, ballistas, machines capable of hurling stones weighing 50 kilograms. On January 29, 1258, the illusions ended. Hell began. Have you ever heard hope breaking? It sounds like marble cracking under the blows of battering rams. The Mongols didn't just storm the city. They methodically dismantled it piece by piece, with cold, surgical precision. They surrounded the city with a moat and a rampart so no one could escape. Not even a rat could slip past Hulagu's tumens. It wasn't a siege. It was a slaughter in a pen. The caliph tried to negotiate. He sent gifts. He promised tribute. But you cannot negotiate with a tsunami. Hulagu accepted the gifts, distributed them to his commanders, and ordered the bombardment to continue. He didn't need money. He needed an example of what happens to those who dare to delay the stride of the Great Khan, even for a moment. On February 10th, Baghdad fell. What followed is difficult to describe in human language. Chronicles say the Mongols entered the city calmly, without unnecessary fuss. They simply started working. 7 days of massacre. 7 days when the sun could not break through the smoke of burning palaces. They killed everyone. Men, women, the elderly, children. Artisans were left alive. Slave labor is always valuable. But steel awaited the rest. Streets once paved with stone became swampy with blood. Literally. Horses slipped. This is not a metaphor. Chroniclers write that the stench of decaying bodies was so strong, the Mongols had to move their camp upwind. But the most terrible crime was committed not against bodies, but against the mind. Baghdad was the house of wisdom. The city's libraries held translations of Aristotle and Plato, treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics. Hundreds of years of human thought, unique manuscripts that existed in a single copy. The Mongols couldn't read these books, but they knew how to use them. They made a bridge out of books. They threw priceless folios into the Tigris River so their horses could cross to the other bank on a paper flooring. Imagine it. The hooves of dirty steppe horses trampling the works of the era's greatest scholars into the silt. The ink washed away by the water. They say that in those days the waters of the Tigris changed color. First, the river flowed red with the blood of murdered citizens, and then it turned black, from ink. Blood and ink. That was the cocktail history served the world in 1258. The cultural code of an entire civilization was erased in 1 week. Knowledge that could have accelerated human progress by centuries dissolved in murky water. And what of the Caliph? The one who considered himself the shadow of God on earth. His end matched Hulagu's grim irony. The Mongols didn't want to spill noble blood on the ground. It was a bad omen. So they rolled the last ruler of Baghdad into a carpet and ran horses over him. The Sultan did not die by the sword. He was trampled into dust along with his arrogance, turned into a sack of broken bones. After the fall of Baghdad, the world froze in paralysis. The horror was so great that cities surrendered without a fight at the mere sight of a Mongol patrol. In Damascus, the rulers brought out the keys to the gates themselves. In Syria, emirs crawled on their knees begging for mercy. It seemed Islamic civilization was over, the caliphate destroyed, the caliph dead. God had turned away. The Mongol death machine, fed and satisfied, stood on the ruins of the East's greatest city. But Hulagu had no intention of stopping. His gaze, cold and calculating, was already sliding further west, to where, beyond the sands of Sinai, on the banks of the Nile, hid the last significant force capable of holding a weapon: Egypt. The wind picked up the ash of the burned Baghdad library. It carried gray flakes across the desert, across the ravaged cities of Syria, across Jerusalem, straight to the walls of the Cairo citadel. There, in stifling barracks, this ash settled on the shoulders of men the whole world considered merely expensive merchandise, on the shoulders of slaves. But these slaves did not tremble. While Mongol horses drank water from the Euphrates poisoned with ink, completely different predators were sharpening their blades in Cairo. Men who had no noble blood to spare, men who had no past, which meant they had nothing to lose. The sunset of civilization had arrived. But night is hunting time for those who can see in the dark. Who were the Mamluks? Ask yourself this question. Textbooks will tell you, a military caste in medieval Egypt. Boring. Forget it. Imagine Spartans, but raised not in love for the polis, but in shackles. These were children of the Kipchak steppes, the very fair-haired demons the Mongols had once crushed and sold into slavery for a handful of silver. They were bought in the slave markets of Damascus and Cairo as raw material, as clay. Boys were torn from their families, converted to Islam, and locked in barracks on an island in the middle of the Nile. Years of drilling, isolation, no family, no homeland, no love. Only a comrade in the ranks and a fencing master. Humanity was beaten out of them, and loyalty and killing skills were pumped in. It was, perhaps, the cruelest and most effective social ladder in history. You enter the barracks as a nobody, a slave without a name, and you leave as a member of the elite, before whom viziers tremble. The sultans of the Ayyubid dynasty thought they were creating ideal robot guards. They were mistaken. They created wolves, and recklessly decided they could keep them on a leash. In the mid-13th century, the wolves ate their masters and took the throne themselves. By the summer of 1260, Cairo was a powder keg. Sultan Qutuz sat on the throne, a usurper, a harsh, calculating man devoid of sentiment. He seized power because the underage heir of the previous sultan could not hold a sword. Qutuz understood. In a storm, a ship needs a captain, not a puppet. But in the shadow of the throne stood another predator, Baibars. Baibars had just returned from exile. Tall, light-eyed, with a cataract in one eye, a mark that made his gaze even more sinister. He and Qutuz hated each other. Only one thing united them: the understanding that the Mongol avalanche would devour them both if they didn't unite. They were two tigers, locked in a single burning cage. And then, in the midst of the suffocating Cairo heat, 4 horsemen rode up to the citadel gates, Mongol ambassadors. They brought no gifts, they did not bow. They walked into the throne room as if they already owned this palace, this city, and the lives of everyone present. In their hands was a letter from Hulagu. The text of this letter has survived. Listen to how the voice of absolute confidence in one's own omnipotence sounds. This is not diplomacy. This is a court sentence. From the King of Kings of the East and West, to the great Mamluk Qutuz, who fled from our swords, you should think about what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard how we conquered a vast empire and purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast territories, killing all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where are you fleeing? What road will you take to avoid us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like lightning, our hearts hard as mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. The silence in the hall was such that you could hear flies buzzing. The emirs, draped in silk and gold, lowered their eyes. They knew what happened to Baghdad. They felt the phantom pain of being flayed alive. Fear, sticky, cold fear, filled the hall. Someone suggested paying them off. Someone spoke of fleeing to the Maghreb. At that moment, history could have followed the usual script: surrender, slavery, oblivion. But Qutuz and Baibars exchanged glances. For the first time in many years, they understood each other without words. They were slaves who became kings. They went through the hell of humiliation to rise to the top. And they were not going to give that peak to steppe barbarians who considered them cattle. The decision Qutuz made was not just a violation of diplomatic protocol. It was sacrilege. Under the laws of Genghis Khan's Yasa, killing an ambassador is a sin washed away only by the total extermination of the guilty party's entire people. Qutuz knew this. Baibars knew this. That is exactly why they did it. By the Sultan's order, the Mongol ambassadors were seized. They weren't just executed. It was a public show. "This is our diplomacy," Cairo seemed to say. 4 bodies were chopped in half. Their heads were impaled on spikes and displayed at the Bab Zuwayla gate. It was a message written in the language the Mongols understood best, the language of violence. Qutuz burned the bridges. Now none of the Mamluks had a way back. Mongols do not accept surrender from those who killed ambassadors. Now every emir, every soldier knew. It was either victory or a death so agonizing that hell would seem like a resort. It was a brilliant psychological move. The Sultan backed his own army into a corner, leaving them no choice. But the main strategic question remained: where to accept the battle? Advisors whispered, "The walls. We need to strengthen the walls of Cairo. Let them break against our defenses." Baibars laughed in their faces. "Walls?" he asked. "Did walls save Baghdad? Did walls save Khwarazm? Sitting behind walls means waiting for Mongol engineers to build their machines. It means giving up the initiative. It means dying slowly." Baibars' plan was insane. He proposed leaving Egypt, crossing the Sinai Desert, entering Palestine and meeting the enemy there, in the open field, forcing a fight on the Mongols when and where they didn't expect it. The Mongols were used to prey hiding and trembling. They were not used to prey baring its teeth and lunging at the hunter. "I will go to the Mongols," declared Qutuz, addressing the wavering emirs. "I will fight them. Whoever wants to protect Islam and their people, come with me. Whoever does not, let him return home to his wives, but let him know the sin for the dishonor of our women will fall on his head." It worked. Shame is a powerful motivator. On July 26, 1260, the vanguard of the Egyptian army left Cairo. Just imagine the scene. Thousands of horsemen in chainmail and helmets with gold inlay. Silent, stern men whose faces were tanned by wind and sun. They marched north. They marched to meet a death machine that hadn't misfired once in the last 40 years. Sand gritted on their teeth. Water in canteens heated up so much it burned their lips. But they marched. Ahead flew the scouts under Baibars' command. He moved like a ghost, checking every dune, every well. He sniffed the air, trying to catch the scent of Mongol horses. They crossed the Gaza border. The Mongol garrison there was small. Hulagu's main forces had gone east due to the death of the Great Khan, leaving only 2 Tumans in Syria under the command of his best general, Kitbuka. But even 20,000 Mongols were worth 100,000 of any other army. Baibars swooped down on the Gaza garrison like a sandstorm. Suddenly, brutally. It was the first blood, the first small victory that made the Mamluks believe Mongols are mortal. They bleed too, if you stick them with a sword. But this was just the prelude. The real game lay ahead. Kitbuka, learning of the slave's audacity, flew into a rage. "They came to me themselves? All the better. I won't have to chase them across the desert." General Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian and veteran of dozens of campaigns, was confident of victory. He gathered his troops and moved south along the Jordan Valley. 2 armies, like 2 storm clouds, were converging on a point geography had marked specially. It was a place where ancient legends intertwined with reality. The Jezreel Valley. the place where, according to legend, David slew Goliath. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. It was here that Baibars decided to arrange the chess pieces for a game where the stake was the existence of the Islamic world. He looked at the landscape through the eyes not of a tourist, but of a killer. Hills, a narrow pass, thickets. Perfect. While the main Mamluk forces hid in the folds of the terrain, Baibars prepared his most dangerous trick. He knew Mongol tactics were built on the feigned retreat. How many armies had perished chasing fleeing Mongols and falling into an ambush? Hundreds. What if, thought Baibars, we use their own weapon against them? What if we convince them we are broken before the real fight even begins? The wind in the valley picked up, raising pillars of yellow dust. The sun began to bake their helmets. The trap was ready. All that remained was to lure the beast into it. Look closely at this valley. If you are a tourist, you will see simply the picturesque hills of Galilee, sun-scorched grass, and a stream lazily flowing among stones. But if you are a military man, you see not a landscape. You see a perfect body bag. Ain Jalut, translated from Arabic, Spring of Goliath. The name itself screamed that here giants fall face down in the mud from the strike of a small stone. And Baibars intended to be that stone. The September sun in Palestine is not a luminary, it is an executioner. On September 3rd, 1260, it hung at its zenith, turning the valley into a scorching frying pan. The air shimmered. The stones were so hot their heat could be felt through boot soles. Baibars chose this place not by accident. He was a predator who had studied his prey for years. He knew things about the Mongols that neither European knights nor Chinese generals knew. He knew their strength lay in space. Mongol cavalry needs room to maneuver, for their famous flanking envelopments, for the endless circling attacks that exhaust the enemy to madness. Lock a Mongol in a narrow corridor, and you deprive him of half his strength. The Ain Jalut Valley was exactly such a corridor. On one side, the steep slopes of Mount Gilboa, on the other, the hills of Galilee. The entrance is wide, like an invitation to visit, but the exit narrows, turning into a bottleneck. An ideal place for murder. But geography alone is not enough. Psychology was needed. Baibars bet on General Kitbukar's most vulnerable spot. No, not a gap in his armor, his ego. Kitbukar was a magnificent commander, a veteran, Hulagu's right hand. But he suffered from the disease of all conquerors. He had forgotten how to fear. For 40 years, the Mongols were used to the enemy either running or dying. They forgot the enemy could think. Kitbukar was furious over the execution of the ambassadors. Anger is a bad advisor. He drove his horses forward, giving them no rest, striving to punish the insolent slaves as quickly as possible. He rushed to an execution, thinking he was riding to a triumph. The Mamluk plan was simple and brilliant, like a dagger blow to the liver. Sultan Qutuz's main forces, heavy cavalry clad in lamellar armor, hid in the folds of the terrain, in wooded ravines along the edges of the valley. They stood quietly, tens of thousands of men and horses. Not a sound, no neighing. They say the horses' muzzles were bound so they wouldn't betray the ambush prematurely. Can you imagine the tension? Standing in the shade of trees, drenched in sweat under padding, gripping a spear with damp palms, knowing that in an hour you will either become a hero or food for vultures. And in the center of the valley, in the most visible spot, the vanguard was to stand. A small detachment. Bait. And Baibars himself volunteered to command this bait. It was pure suicide by all canons of military science. To stand with a handful of men against the full might of a Mongol tumen, But Baibars knew Mongols would only bite on a big fish. If they saw a commander known for his audacity, they would want his head. While the army waited, an atmosphere of cold calculation reigned in the command tent. No wasted words. Qutuz and Baibars discussed the final details. "They will strike the center," said Baibars, drawing in the sand with a dagger. "They will try to crush us with mass. Kitbuka won't maneuver. He despises us too much. He'll want to break our spine with one blow." "And you must withstand that blow," Qutuz replied quietly. "You must let them taste blood, but not let them eat you whole." It was a game of nerves. If the vanguard ran too early, the Mongols would smell a rat and stop. If the vanguard lingered, they would simply be trampled into dust, and the trap wouldn't snap shut. Baibars had to walk a razor's edge. He had to play the role of a panicking victim so convincingly that Stanislavski, had he been born in the 13th century, would have given a standing ovation. The night before the battle was agonizing. In the Mamluk camp, they prayed. Imams walked among the ranks of warriors reciting surahs about jihad, but the soldiers' eyes said otherwise. They were afraid. It was animal fear of the monsters who burned Baghdad. Everyone knew there would be no prisoners. The Mongols didn't take prisoners of those who resisted. Defeat meant death not only for them, but for their families in Cairo, for all of Egypt, for the entire faith. And on the other side of the valley, where thousands of Mongol campfires flickered in the dark, a completely different mood prevailed. There, they drank kumis, sharpened curved sabers, and divided the spoils of a war they hadn't yet won. Kitbuka was sure it would all be over by lunch tomorrow. Scouts reported seeing only a small detachment of Mamluks in the valley. Cowards, he surely thought. They couldn't even assemble a full army. He didn't know he was seeing only the tip of the iceberg. The dawn of September 3rd painted the sky the color of clotted blood. The fog creeping along the lowlands began to dissipate, and then the silence was torn by a sound. Doom. 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 Mongol war drums. Huge, stretched with human skin, they set a rhythm that made the heart skip a beat. Baibars sat on his horse in the center of the valley, looking north. He saw the horizon darkening. The horde was moving. First dust, then a forest of banners with yak-tails, then the glint of steel. 10, maybe 15,000 horsemen. The best military machine in the world was drawing up into battle formation. They marched in perfectly even rows. Mongol discipline was legendary. No noise, no shouting, only the rumble of the earth and the whistling of the wind in the banner tops. In the center, under a huge standard, rode Kitbuka. He was calm. He saw before him a handful of Mamluks who looked like children deciding to play war with giants. Baibars smirked. He checked if his saber slid easily from its sheath. He looked back at his men. Their faces were grey with tension, but no one looked away. They were the Bahri, an elite corps, his personal guard. They had gone through fire and water with him. Now they had to go through the copper pipes of the Mongol horn. "Remember!" shouted Baibars, his voice sharp and guttural, cutting through the wind noise. "We are not fighting to win. Right now, we are fighting to survive. Let them come close. Let them believe we are their prey. And when the beast opens its maw, we will tear out its fangs." The first arrow whistled into the sand at the hooves of Baibars' horse. The distance was closing. 300 meters. 250. Mongol archers raised their bows. The sky darkened from a cloud of arrows. The deadly game had begun. The pieces were set. The trap was cocked. All that remained was to pull the trigger, and that trigger was Baibars' own life. He kicked his horse's flanks and threw it forward, toward the avalanche, pretending to accept the challenge, only to perform the most dangerous maneuver in the history of warfare a moment later. The valley froze in anticipation of the first clash of steel on steel. Time compressed into a tight spring. Now it would uncoil, and the world would change forever. Impact. Have you ever heard the sound of two avalanches of flesh and iron colliding? It is not the ringing of swords as shown in movies. It is a dull, sickening crunch. The sound of air being knocked out of lungs, the sound of breaking ribs and tearing tendons. In the first second of the Battle of Ain Jalut, the world ceased to exist in the usual sense, shrinking to the radius of a saber swing. Baibars was in the very center of this storm. His vanguard smashed into the Mongol forward hundreds, and the meat grinder began. The Mamluks, those dogs of war bred for killing, fought like men possessed. They slashed from the shoulder, parried blows with shields, stabbed horses. But there were few of them, negligibly few against the endless stream of steppe warriors rolling in from the north. The Mongol horsemen, used to sweeping away everything in their path, were surprised. These slaves did not fall face down. They bit, they snapped back. Every meter of ground had to be taken with a fight. Kitbuka, watching the battle from a hill, frowned. The enemy's stubbornness annoyed him like a buzzing fly. He waved his hand, sending fresh forces into battle. And at that moment, Baibars did what it was all for. He gave the signal. It was the most difficult order in military history. Ordering a soldier whose blood is boiling with adrenaline to turn around and run is madness. A warrior's instinct demands either fighting or dying facing the enemy. Turning one's back means admitting defeat. It is a disgrace. It is death. But Mamluk discipline was stronger than instincts. They wavered. First one flank, then the center. The ranks mixed. Someone dropped a shield. Someone turned their horse around. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of panic, like the moment when an army's will breaks under the pressure of fear. Imagine you are a Mongol decadarch. You see the hated enemy, who just killed your brother in arms, start to back away. You see their backs. You see their fear. What do you feel? Relief? No. You feel the thrill of the hunter. Blood rushes to your head. The prey ran. And when prey runs, the predator doesn't think. The predator chases. "They're running!" swept through the ranks of the Mongol army. Kitbuka saw what he wanted to see. Weakness. He saw confirmation of his superiority. His lips stretched into a predatory smile. Why wait? Why be cautious? Finish them off here and now, before they regroup. The discipline of the Iron Horde, which had held for decades, cracked. No, they didn't break formation, but the thirst for easy blood made them forget caution. The entire Mongol army, tens of thousands of horsemen, moved out. The earth groaned. They rushed forward, chasing Baibars' retreating vanguard. Now transport yourself into Baibars' saddle. The wind whistles in your ears. Your back burns with the expectation of a Mongol arrow. He gallops, but not too fast. It is an art, running to make it look like you're saving your life, but keeping a distance that allows the enemy to breathe down your neck. If you ride too fast, the chase stretches out and loses momentum. If too slow, you get crushed and trampled. He looks back. Through clouds of yellow dust, he sees them. Bared teeth, foaming horse mouths, the glint of arrowheads. Death races at his heels,
reaching out with bony fingers to grab his cloak.
"Closer," he whispers, gripping the reins until his knuckles are white. "Even closer, bastards."
It was playing with fire, where the stake was not just life, but the very existence of his people. Baibars led them deep into the valley, past bushes where death lurked, past ravines where thousands of Mamluks froze. The dust raised by thousands of hooves became his best ally. It hid the valley edges. It created tunnel vision. The Mongols saw only the backs of fleeing slaves, and nothing else. They flew into the bottleneck. The Mongol cavalry stretched out in a long, roaring snake, filling the entire space between the hills. They screamed, anticipating the slaughter. They were already dividing the loot in their minds. Kitbuka, succumbing to the general impulse, drove his main forces forward, straight into the center of the cauldron. He was sure the Mamluks were running south, trying to save themselves in the desert. But Baibars knew there was nowhere to run, and no reason to. He reached the agreed point, a lonely, twisted tree standing like a sentry in the middle of the wasteland. Here the play ended, and reality began. Baibars sharply pulled the reins. His horse, snorting and tearing up the earth with its hooves, reared up. Around him, hundreds of Mamluks of his vanguard did the same. In an instant, the chaotic crowd of fugitives turned 180 degrees, shields locked, spears lowered. The Mongols, flying at full gallop, didn't have time to break. The front ranks crashed into a wall of Mamluk steel. Horses fell, breaking legs. Riders flew out of saddles, falling right under the hooves of their own comrades. From behind, new thousands pressed in, not seeing the jam ahead, crushing their own. A pileup of bodies, screams, and agony formed. And at that moment, when the chaos reached its peak, something happened that Kitbuka could not have imagined in his worst nightmares. The hills came alive. From all sides, from the forests, from behind rocks, from the very earth rose the banners of Islam. Trumpets roared so that it seemed the sky split in two. The thunder of drums, nakara, hit the ears, drowning out the groans of the wounded. From the left, right, rear, Mamluks were everywhere. Sultan Qutuz's heavy cavalry, fresh, furious, waiting for this moment for hours, poured down from the slopes like an avalanche. The trap snapped shut. The sound of that shutting was more terrible than any thunder. It was the sound of realization. Thousands of Mongol eyes widened in horror simultaneously. The hunter instantly, in a fraction of a second, turned into game. They were in a bag. There was no room for maneuver. Their favorite tactic, circle and shoot, became impossible. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, like sardines in a can, unable to even swing a saber. Kitbuka understood everything instantly. He was an old wolf and knew the smell of a trap. But it was too late. Too late. His arrogance had led his army into a grave. But Mongols wouldn't be Mongols if they surrendered without a fight. A beast cornered fights with triple strength. And now, in this cramped, dusty hell, the bloodiest chapter of this story began. Baibars dropped the fugitive's mask. Now there was only cold, triumphant rage on his face. He raised his sword, pointing to the center of the enemy formation, to where the Mongol general's horsetail standard fluttered. The dance with death was over. The massacre began. Hell is not a mythological dungeon with cauldrons. Hell is the Ain Jalut Valley at noon on September 3rd, 1260. Imagine a grape press, only instead of berries, it holds living people and horses, and instead of juice, hot, sticky blood. The trap snapped shut,
and its jaws clamped down with such force that the crunch of bones drowned out the clash of metal. The Mongols found themselves in a situation not written in their military manuals. They were used to being the wind, elusive and deadly. And here they were, turned into stone, being struck by a hammer. Space shrank to the length of a blade. Bows, the steppe warrior's main weapon, became useless. Try drawing a bowstring when an enemy shield hits you in the face, and the rider next to you is pressed so tight he can't even raise his arm. It was a slaughter. But don't think the Mongols panicked. Oh no. These were veterans who had conquered half the world. When a beast realizes there is nowhere to run, it doesn't whine. It turns into a killing machine. The initial shock of sudden encirclement was replaced by cold, crystal-clear rage. "We will die," read in their eyes, "but we will take so many slaves with us that hell will get crowded." Kitbuka, the old wolf, quickly assessed the situation. He saw a weak spot in the encirclement ring: the Mamluk left flank. Less experienced units stood there, and it was there that the Mongol general directed the full power of his desperate breakthrough. It was like a battering ram strike. The Mongols, forgetting defense, threw themselves at the left flank with such frenzy that the Egyptian line wavered. The situation became critical. Another minute and the ring would break. The Mongols would break out into operational space, regroup, and then the hunters would become victims again. The Mamluks began to back away. That same treacherous fear appeared in their eyes again, the ghost of Baghdad whispering, "They cannot be defeated. These are demons." It was at this moment, when the scales of history wavered, ready to tip toward darkness, that Sultan Qutuz entered the stage. He watched the battle from a height, surrounded by bodyguards. He saw his left flank buckling under Mongol cavalry blows. He saw panic transmitting like an infection from soldier to soldier. A gesture was needed. A miracle was needed, and he created it himself. Qutuz tore the helmet from his head. It was a mad, theatrical, but brilliant act. In the thick of battle, where any stray arrow meant death, the ruler bared his head. He threw the helmet to the ground with such force that it seemed to crack the stone. Thousands saw his face, distorted by rage and pleading. "O Islam!" he screamed. "O Islam! I, Qutuz, do not spare my life, so will you spare yours?" This cry cut through the noise of battle. The Sultan drew his sword and, without looking back, rushed into the thickest of the fray. Alone, without cover, straight under the hooves of Mongol horses. The effect was instantaneous. It was an electric shock breaking the paralysis of fear. Soldiers saw their sultan flying to death with hair streaming. Shame burned them stronger than fire. How can we retreat when our master goes to die? This thought raced through thousands of heads simultaneously. The Mamluks roared. It was no longer a battle cry. It was the howl of a pack protecting its leader. Those retreating turned around. Reserves, forgetting orders, rushed after the Sultan. They hit the Mongols with such force as if the desert itself had risen against the invaders. The density of the fight became such that the dead did not fall. Their bodies remained standing, wedged between the living. Kitbuka saw it. He saw his Tumans, his invincible warriors, melting under Egyptian steel blows. He was offered escape. Bodyguards shouted that they could still break through, escape to the mountains. But the Mongol Noyan's pride weighed more than his life. "I will not run like a cowardly jackal," shouted Kitbuka. "Let my master know that I did not give up a single inch of land without a fight." He fought to the end. His horse was killed under him. He fought on foot. Legends say he, an old man, laid low dozens of Mamluks before he was surrounded. He wasn't killed in battle. He was taken alive. Too valuable a trophy. He was dragged to the Sultan's tent, bound, wounded, but unbroken. Imagine the scene. The victor and the vanquished. Qutuz, breathing heavily, covered in dust and foreign blood, and Kitbuka, kneeling, but looking down on the Sultan. "Do not rejoice," rasped the Mongol. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "When my Khan learns of my death, his wrath will shake the earth from east to west. Horse hooves will beat this earth all the way to Egypt. I was a loyal servant to my master, and you? You are traitors who killed your masters." Kitbuka spat in the direction of the victors. He knew he would die, and used his last words as a whip. But Qutuz didn't need lectures on loyalty from an executioner of nations. He nodded to the executioner. Steel flashed in the sun. The head of the great Noyan, conqueror of fortresses, rolled across the sands of Ain Jalut. At that moment, something changed in the very air. The silence that fell after the battle was deafening. Mamluks stood among mountains of corpses, leaning on bloody swords, looking at each other in disbelief. They did it. Look at the bodies lying in the valley. Mongols, the very demons whispered about in fear from China to Poland. They lay in the dust, crumpled, dead. Their blood was red, their bones broke, their guts spilled out just like any other humans. The myth of invincibility collapsed. The great lie that paralyzed the will of entire nations was dispelled by the stroke of a Mamluk saber. The Mongols were not messengers of hell. They were just people. Dangerous, cruel, strong, but mortal. And they could be killed. Baibars stood aside, wiping his blade with a piece of silk torn from a dead Mongol officer. He looked at Kitbuka's headless body, then shifted his gaze to the triumphant Qutuz, whom soldiers were tossing in the air. There was no euphoria in his eyes. There was cold calculation. Yes, civilization was saved. The Islamic world survived. The Mongol invasion flood crashed against the rock of Mamluk will. But victory is a dangerous wine. It makes the head spin. Sultan Qutuz now felt like heaven's chosen one. He thought the worst was behind him. What a mistake. Baibars threw the bloody rag on the ground. The real war, the war for who would get the laurels of savior, was just beginning. And in this war, there would be no rules, honor, or open battles. Only poison, a dagger, and whispers in the dark. The sun was setting behind the hills of Galilee, painting the battlefield in crimson tones. Vultures were already descending from the heavens, smelling a feast. They didn't distinguish where the victor's flesh was and where the loser's. To them, all were equal. But for history, written by survivors, everything was just beginning. The blood on the sands of Ain Jalut hadn't even dried, yet in Baibars' heart, a darkness was ripening, thicker than the night descending on the desert. Victory is the most dangerous drug. It makes blood boil, dulls the instinct of self-preservation, and whispers sweet lies that you are now immortal. Sultan Qutuz was drunk on this victory. He rode through the streets of liberated Damascus, and people threw flowers under his horse's hooves. They kissed the hem of his cloak. They called him the Sword of Islam. He believed them. He believed he was the only hero of this drama. What a fatal mistake. In the shadow of his triumph rode a man whose eyes were not clouded by the fog of glory.
Baibars. The man who was the bait in the Valley of Death. The man who took the first blow of the Mongol cavalry. He looked at the Sultan's back and saw not a savior of the faith, but a debtor refusing to pay the bill. The deal was simple. Politics is business, nothing personal. Before the battle, Qutuz, needing Baibars' sword, promised him Aleppo, a city in the north, the key to Syria, a rich, powerful, strategically important prize. Baibars fulfilled his part of the deal. He saved the army. He broke the Mongols' spine. But when the smoke of battle cleared, Qutuz forgot his promise. "Aleppo is too big for someone like you," the Sultan said. Perhaps he thought Baibars would swallow the insult like an obedient dog. Perhaps he feared giving such a dangerous predator as Baibars his own power base. In any case, the moment Qutuz denied Baibars Aleppo, he signed his own death warrant. The ink dried instantly. The way back to Egypt became a road of death. The army moved through the sands of Sinai, returning home. Soldiers sang victory songs, drove carts with looted Mongol goods, anticipated meetings with wives. But in Baibars' tent, a completely different atmosphere reigned. They didn't sing there. They sharpened knives. The conspiracy matured quickly. Discontent is fuel, and Baibars was a master of lighting the match. He gathered a group of emirs around him who also felt cheated, or simply understood which way the wind was blowing. They whispered by campfires, exchanged glances, nods. The plan was simple, brutal, and devoid of any chivalry. No duels, no challenges. A stab in the back. Classic power struggle. October 24th, 1260. Remember this date, the day history showed its cynical grin again. The army camped near Salihiyah, just a few marches from Cairo. The capital was close. Qutuz, relaxed and confident, decided to hunt. Hunting hares in the desert is a favorite pastime of Mamluks. It is a sport requiring speed, reaction, and privacy. The Sultan separated from the main body of troops. With him was only a small retinue, and, of course, his loyal comrades, including Baibars. Qutuz saw no threat. Why should he be afraid? They had just saved the world together. They were brothers in arms. Can you raise a hand against someone with whom you drank water from the same canteen in the face of death? Turns out, you can, and very easily. The scene played out quickly, like in a bad dream. A hare darted out of the bushes. The retinue rushed in pursuit. In the turmoil of the chase, dust, and excitement, Qutuz found himself surrounded by conspirators. They encircled him, not with threats, but with smiles. One emir rode up to the Sultan with a request. "O great Sultan," he said, "give me this Mongol girl we captured." Qutuz, in a benevolent mood, nodded. "Take her. She is yours." The emir, feigning overflowing gratitude, approached to kiss the ruler's hand. It was an old trick, old as the world. A Judas kiss. But instead of a kiss, the emir gripped the Sultan's hand tight, preventing him from drawing his sword. That was the signal. Baibars didn't wait. He didn't make pompous speeches. He struck. The sword entered the neck or side. Chronicles differ on details, but agree on the result. Qutuz, hero of Ain Jalut, conqueror of the invincible, fell from the saddle into the dust, choking on his own blood. He didn't die on the battlefield, looking into an enemy's eyes. He died in the dirt, looking into the eyes of a man he called a friend. His body was still twitching in agony when the emirs dismounted. The question of succession was decided right there, over the warm corpse. No elections, no councils of elders, the pragmatism of killers. First, the emirs offered the throne to the one who struck the first blow, the emir who grabbed the sultan's hand. He turned pale and refused. He understood. Killing a sultan is one thing, holding power is another. Then Aktash, the oldest of the conspirators, stepped forward. He looked at Baibars, who was wiping blood from his blade. "Who killed him?" asked Aktash, nodding at Qutuz's body. "I did," replied Baibars, simply, without a tremor in his voice, as if admitting to breaking a pitcher. "Then," said Aktash, "take his place." That is how history is made. 5 minutes ago you were a rebel and a murderer whose head belonged on a chopping block. Now you are the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Legitimacy in this world is measured by the length of your sword and the resolve to use it. Qutuz's body was left in the desert. The hero who saved Islamic civilization from destruction wasn't even buried immediately. His bones remained lying under the sun until a compassionate servant covered them with sand. Such is the price of ambition. Such is history's gratitude. Baibars mounted his horse. Now it was his army, his country, and his war. He felt no remorse. Conscience is a luxury for those who do not want to rule the world. He knew he did what was necessary. Qutuz was a good soldier, but he was a man of the past, and Baibars was a man of the future. But that future tasted of iron. Killing a sultan is a sin that cannot be washed away with prayer. Baibars understood. From this moment on, he was alone, completely alone. Every emir who helped him kill Qutuz today might want to repeat the trick with him tomorrow. A precedent was set. The throne is free for anyone brave enough to stick a knife. The wind drove tumbleweeds across the Sinai. The army continued the march to Cairo. Soldiers, learning of the Sultan's death, merely shrugged. The king is dead. Long live the king. They didn't care whose name they shouted, as long as they were paid in gold and allowed to loot enemies. In Cairo, a throne awaited Baibars. But this throne wasn't a soft sofa with pillows. It was a 13th century electric chair. And Baibars, the Panther, as he was called for his coat of arms with a lion, was ready to sit on it. He intended to rule not by love, but by fear. And he intended to turn fear into the most effective weapon of his new empire. The blood on the Sinai sands dried quickly, but the stain on Baibars' reputation remained forever. To some, he became a savior. To others, a regicide. But he didn't give a damn about the opinions of descendants. He cared about only one thing: how to hold the power he tore from fate with his teeth. And he knew the answer. War. Endless, total war. Sultan Baibars didn't just sit on the throne. He turned it into an operations center. If you think running a state in the 13th century meant boring feasts and reading poetry, you are mistaken. For Baibars, power was merely a tool to create the most perfect military machine the Middle East had ever seen. He understood a simple truth inaccessible to European kings of that time. Information kills faster than poison. First, he created the Barid, a postal service working with the speed of the modern internet, only on horsepower. Imagine a network of stations scattered from the Nile to the Euphrates. Fresh horses every 30 kilometers. Messengers who didn't sleep or eat, but only rode, changing horses on the fly. Baibars in Cairo knew what was happening in Damascus faster than the dust from hooves settled there. He played polo in Cairo and Damascus in the same week. He was omnipresent. And this inspired superstitious terror. But the male was just the nervous system. He needed eyes. Baibars built a spy network that the CIA would envy. His spies were everywhere, in the bedrooms of enemy kings, in the kitchens of Mongol khans, in the cells of Christian monks. He knew what crusaders whispered in Acre before they could even finish a sentence. They say he loved to dress as a dervish and walk the bazaars of Cairo, listening to what the people said about him. Paranoia? Certainly. But in his world, paranoia is the only condition for survival. Europe still lived in illusions of the Richard the Lionheart era. Chivalry, honor, noble duels. Baibars looked at this with the contemptuous sneer of a predator watching a dancing peacock. He wasn't going to play by the rules. He didn't come to defeat the Crusaders. He came to eradicate them, to erase them. To burn them out so that even the memory of them vanished from the face of the East. The year 1268. Antioch. An ancient, fabulously wealthy city, the pearl of the Christian East. For 170 years, it was an impregnable stronghold of the Franks. Baibars came to its walls not for long negotiations. He came to punish. The assault was short and brutal. 4 days. It took the Panther only 4 days to crack defenses that had stood for centuries. What happened next made the entire Christian world shudder. This was not a noble conquest in the style of Saladin, who released prisoners for ransom. This was a slaughter. The city was locked. All men were killed. All women and children sold into slavery. Antioch's gold was distributed in bowls like lentil soup. Slave prices in markets dropped so low that a young man went for less than a good mule. The Prince of Antioch, Bohemond VI, was in Tripoli at the time. He missed the fall of his city, and Baibars, in his trademark manner of mocking cynicism, wrote him a letter. This is not a diplomatic document. It is a masterpiece of psychological sadism. Listen to how the voice of a victor reveling in the enemy's humiliation sounds. If you had seen your knights trampled by horses, your women sold for a dinar, your treasures divided by measures, if you had seen fire devouring your palaces and the dead burning in the flames of this world before the flames of the next, you would have wished to turn to dust. Baibars didn't just report the defeat. He painted a picture of hell, forcing Bohemond to live through this horror again and again. Rejoice that you were not there, the Sultan concluded. It was a spit in the soul of all Western chivalry. But the most terrible blow for the Crusaders was not Antioch. It was Crac des Chevaliers, the castle of the Hospitallers, the pinnacle of medieval fortification art, an eagle's nest carved from rock, a double ring of walls, towers reaching the sky, a garrison of fanatic warrior monks. Taking Crac by storm was considered impossible. Its walls laughed at catapults. In 1271, Baibars brought his army to the foot of this mountain. He looked at the gray towers and understood. Force wouldn't take this. You could lay 10,000 soldiers here and achieve nothing. But where steel is powerless, ink works. Baibars began the siege. Heavy trebuchets pounded the walls, sappers dug tunnels. But this was just a distraction. The main weapon was being prepared in the Sultan's chancellery. Baibars' spies intercepted messengers. The besieged knights were waiting for help from Tripoli. They hoped the Count would send reinforcements. Baibars decided to help them get an answer. His scribes, masters of forgery, created a letter, a perfect copy of the Count of Tripoli's handwriting and seal. The letter stated, "There will be no help. We are defeated.
Surrender the fortress to save your lives."
Imagine the moment. The Grand Master of the Hospitallers holds this piece of parchment. He sees the familiar seal, He reads the words of his suzerain. His world collapses. Faith in the Brotherhood's invincibility, in help, in divine providence. Everything crumbles to dust. If there is no help, resistance is not heroism, but suicide. On April 8th, the garrison of the world's greatest fortress capitulated. They walked out the gates with heads bowed, clutching their belongings. Invincible knights. They surrendered a castle that could have held for years, deceived by a piece of paper. Baibars stood and watched them leave. He kept his word. He didn't kill them. Why? Living, broken, humiliated knights were more useful than dead ones. They would spread news of his invincibility better than any heralds. They would tell everyone that you cannot hide from Baibars, even behind stone walls 5 meters thick.
The taking of Crac de Chevalier marked the end of an era. The Crusaders realized their time was up. God was no longer on their side. Only fear was on their side. Baibars redrew the map of the Middle East with a scalpel of terror. He burned cities so they wouldn't fall to the enemy. He relocated peoples. He executed and pardoned with an arbitrariness that made heads spin. He was effective as a guillotine. But this efficiency had a price. Power built on fear requires constant fueling. You cannot stop. You cannot relax. You cannot turn your back even on your own shadow. The Sultan, who could deceive the wiliest enemies, who could take impregnable fortresses without firing a shot, became lonelier every year. His palace was full of servants, wives, children, but around him was a void, a vacuum of mistrust. He saw betrayal in every glance, in every whisper. He had defeated all external enemies. The Mongols were thrown back beyond the Euphrates. The Crusaders were driven into the surf. The assassins were destroyed.
But the most terrible enemy, the one that cannot be killed with a sword, waited for him not on the battlefield. It waited for him in the mirror. And in the silence of huge, empty halls, where the echo of footsteps sounded like the tread of an assassin, Baibars began to understand. The top of the world is a very cold place. And from this peak, there is only one way: down. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be the most powerful man on earth, yet fear your own shadow? Power is not just gold and harems. It is loneliness so deep you can drown in it. For 17 years, Sultan Baibars ruled Egypt and Syria. For 17 years, he slept in chainmail. For 17 years, he peered into the faces of his slaves, viziers, and sons, trying to guess which one holds a dagger behind his back. Paranoia became his only faithful mistress. She whispered in his ear at night.
She forced him to change bedrooms every day so assassins wouldn't know where to look for the Sultan's body.
He had food tasters, water tasters, wine tasters. But who checks the taster? In the world Baibars built, trust was a currency long out of circulation. He created a system where betrayal was the norm, and now he became its prisoner. By 1277, Baibars was tired. It wasn't physical fatigue, although scars on his body ached before rain. It was mental fatigue. When a blade strikes stone too long, microcracks appear in the steel structure. Sooner or later, it will break. Baibars was over 50. For a warrior of that era, deep old age. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. To drown out the voices in his head, he needed a war. A loud, bloody, impossible war. And he decided to do the unthinkable. He decided to strike the Mongols in the very heart of their domains in the Middle East, Anatolia. It was a campaign against logic.
Leaving Egypt, marching through all of Syria, crossing mountain ranges, and invading the territory of the Sultanate of Rum, which was a vassal of the Mongol Ilkhans. It's like sticking your hand in a beehive to check if there are any bees left. In the spring of 1277, the Mamluk army moved north. The landscape changed. Yellow sands gave way to green highlands and snow-capped peaks. The air here was thin and cold. It smelled not of dust, but of pine needles and icy water. Baibars led his wolves where no one expected them. The Mongols were used to attacking. They were not used to defending. On April 15th, two armies met on the Elbistan plain. If Ain Jalut was a miracle and a desperate gambit, Elbistan became a professional's masterclass. There was no room for chance here. Baibars brought the best. Heavy Mamluk cavalry, clad in steel, against Mongol cavalry, reinforced by Georgian and Armenian detachments, as well as Seljuk vassal. The battle began in the morning. The Mongols, true to their tactics, tried to flank the Mamluk left. They crashed down on the Egyptians with the fury of a winter storm. The Mamluks wavered. Several Bedouin detachments on the flank ran. It seemed history was repeating itself, and the Mongol death machine would grind up the brave. But Baibars was there. He personally led the counterattack. Imagine the moment. The Sultan, ruler of an empire, back in the saddle, in the thick of the hacking. He wasn't commanding from a tent. He was slashing from the shoulder. His presence acted on the soldiers like a drug. They saw his banner, heard his voice, and forgot fear. The Mamluks regrouped and struck back. It was a meat grinder. The Mongols, who considered themselves the world's best warriors, encountered a mirror. The Mamluks used the same bows, the same horses, the same tactics, but they had the fury of men fighting for their faith, not for a distant Khan. Mongol officers, seeing their formation crumbling, ordered to dismount. They stood as a wall, shielding themselves with horses, shooting to the last arrow. No one surrendered. The Mongols didn't ask for mercy, and Baibars gave none. By noon, the Elbistan plain was strewn with corpses. 6,700 Mongols lay in the grass. It wasn't just a victory. It was the annihilation of an entire Mongol occupation army. Baibars walked the battlefield among the bodies. He looked at the faces of dead enemies and felt no joy. Only the cold satisfaction of a butcher who met his quota. The way to Kayseri, ancient Caesarea, the Seljuk capital, was open. Baibars entered the city as a triumphant victor. The streets were decorated, but people hid their eyes. They were afraid. They knew. Today the Mamluks are here, but tomorrow the Mongols will return, and their revenge will be terrible. The Sultan rode to the palace and entered the throne room. This is the culmination of his career. A former slave, sold for pennies, ascended the throne of ancient Seljuk sultans. He sat in Khosrow's seat. He accepted congratulations, listened to poets praising his feat, distributed gold. He ordered coins minted with his name, right here, in the heart of Anatolia. But sitting on that throne, he felt a piercing cold. He waited for an uprising. He calculated that the Muslims of Anatolia, seeing Egypt's strength, would rise against the Mongol yoke. He thought he would be the spark to ignite the flame of liberation. But the answer was silence. The local nobility was too intimidated by decades of Mongol terror. They smiled at Baibars, bowed, ate his food, but one thing read in their eyes: leave. You came and will go, but we have to live here with the monsters. Baibars realized it was a dead end. He won the battle but lost the campaign. He had gone too far. His supply lines were stretched. He didn't have the resources to hold Anatolia forever. The greatest victory turned into a strategic trap. He, the invincible Sultan, had to give the order to retreat. Back. Into the saddle again.
dust of the roads again, waiting for a stab in the back again. On the way back, he saw his army dragging loot, soldiers leading captives, laughing. But Baibars rode in silence. He felt time slipping through his fingers like sand. He reached the peak of power, but there, at the top, was nothing but icy wind and loneliness. He was returning to Damascus, the city of gardens and fountains, but for Baibars, Damascus now looked like a crypt. He became suspicious to the extreme. It seemed to him that even the air was poisoned. He looked at his entourage and saw vultures circling a dying lion. In this campaign, he proved to everyone he was still that Baibars. He defeated the Mongols. He humiliated the Ilkhan. He sat on the throne of another empire. But something inside him snapped. The shadow of paranoia that pursued him all his life now covered him completely. He became a prisoner of his own legend, and fate's irony was preparing a final surprise. He sought death by the sword on the field of Elbistan, but death, like a capricious woman, denied him that date. She waited for him not in battle, amidst the noble clang of steel, but in the silence of a banquet hall, in a goblet with a cool drink. The great strategist who calculated moves 10 steps ahead didn't notice the simplest trap set by fate itself. History doesn't like happy endings for tyrants. It prefers instructive finales. And Baibars' finale was already close, dissolved in wine and ambition. Damascus, July 1277. The heat is such that the air seems thick as syrup. In the Al-Ablaq Palace, built of black and yellow stone, a feast is underway. But this is not a celebration. It is a poker game where lives are at stake, and every player has an ace hidden up his sleeve. Or a stiletto.
Sultan Baibars sits at the head of the table. He smiles, but his eyes scan the hall like a sniper's. He returned from Anatolia a victor, but fear lives inside him. He thinks conspirators are everywhere. He is particularly worried about one man, an emir from the Ayyubid dynasty, a shadow of the past. As long as even one descendant of Saladin is alive, the throne of Baibars, a usurper and former slave, wobbles. A tyrant's logic is simple. No man, no problem. Baibars decided not to use an executioner. Public execution could cause a riot. Poison. That is the choice of a true politician. Quiet. Clean. And you can always blame it on Allah's will, or indigestion. Imagine the scene. Music plays softly, drowning out the clinking of dishes. Slave girls serve fruit and sherbet. Baibars personally prepares a drink for his guest. It is kumis, fermented mare's milk, the steppe warrior's favorite drink. But into this goblet, the Sultan adds a special ingredient. Poison that acts not instantly, but slowly, burning the insides. He hands the cup to the emir. "Drink, my friend," says Baibars. His voice sounds soft, almost fatherly. "Refresh yourself after a long day." The emir takes the cup. He is no fool. He knows who is in front of him. He hesitates. The look of a cornered beast darts around the hall. And then Baibars, to dispel suspicions, does what he has done hundreds of times. He takes another cup, pours for himself, and raises a toast. Or, as one of the most sinister legends goes, distracted for a moment by conversation, he makes a fatal mistake and takes the wrong cup. Or perhaps a servant, trembling with fear, mixed up the trays? History turns into fog here, but the fact remains, solid as a tombstone. The emir drank. And Baibars drank.
The plan worked halfway. The emir died that same night. He was carried out of the palace feet first, and no one asked unnecessary questions. Baibars should have triumphed.
Another piece removed from the board. But the next morning, the Sultan could not get out of bed. The agony began. It was not the quick death he gave enemies on the battlefield. It was torture. 2 weeks. 14 endless days and nights. The great Panther, the man who broke the spines of empires, broke from within himself. The poison corroded his stomach. His body temperature rose so high that servants had to pack him in ice brought from the peaks of Mount Hermon. Doctors fussed around the bed, whispering prayers, offering antidotes. But what could they do? They were afraid even to raise their eyes to the dying master. They knew, if the Sultan died, they would be accused of negligence and executed. If the Sultan survived, he would execute them for witnessing his weakness. Imagine the humiliation of a warrior confined to a bed. A man used to commanding armies with a wave of his hand now couldn't even drink water on his own. His body, covered in scars from Mongol arrows and Frankish swords, betrayed him. He screamed in pain, and that scream echoed through the empty corridors of the palace, making the guards turn pale. Fate has a twisted sense of humor. Baibars wove intrigues all his life. He killed Qutuz. He deceived crusaders with forged letters. He built a state on lies and espionage. And he died from his own cunning. The poisoned cup intended for another returned to him like a boomerang. As they say, he who digs a pit for another falls into it himself. Only Baibars' pit turned out to be lined with silk, but that didn't stop it from being a grave. On July 1st, 1277, the Sultan's heart stopped. The great Baibars, 4th Sultan of Egypt, conqueror of Mongols, scourge of crusaders, died at the age of 54. Not by the sword, not from old age, from a stupid, tragic mistake. From a sip of sour milk tainted with arsenic. But even after death, he had no peace. His inner circle was in panic. The Sultan's death at such a moment is a catastrophe. The heirs are weak, enemies are strong. If the news gets outside the palace walls, a massacre will begin. So they decided to play one last show. Baibars' body was hidden. Imagine the surrealism. The ruler of a huge empire is secretly wrapped in carpets and hidden in one of the far rooms of the palace. Meanwhile, viziers go out to the people and announce, "The Sultan is ill, but recovering." He ordered the march to Egypt. They put another man in the Sultan's palanquin, or, according to other versions, drove an empty palanquin with curtains drawn tight. The army marched, saluting emptiness. Doctors entered the empty tent, pretending to change bandages. Cooks prepared food that was later thrown away. It was a grand hoax. The dead Sultan continued to rule his army for several weeks, while his body rotted in the Damascus heat. Only when they reached Cairo and secured the heir's power was the truth revealed. But Baibars' body remained in Damascus. He was buried secretly, at night, without the lavish processions befitting a monarch of such rank. His grave is in the Al-Zahiriya library, opposite the great Umayyad mosque. A humble end for a man who considered himself the shadow of God on earth. Lying in the darkness of the crypt, Baibars would probably laugh, wickedly and bitterly. He understood that life is just a series of deals with death, and the last deal is impossible to win. He left behind an empire that would stand for another 250 years. He left behind a legend that would outlive empires. But in that last moment, when the light faded in his eyes, he was just a frightened man who realized he had been billed for all his victories. And payment on this bill was accepted only in soul. Thus ended the path of the slave who became a king.
the path of the killer who became a savior.
But history doesn't put a period. History puts an ellipsis.
Sand covered Baibars' grave, but the echo of his deeds still sounds in the streets of Cairo and Damascus. Monsters leave, but the scars they leave on the body of the world never heal. Now we just have to sum up, weigh on the scales of history what he accomplished. Was he a hero or a monster? Or maybe history teaches us that sometimes these two concepts are one and the same. The answer awaits us where a biography ends and the immortality of myth begins. So who was he really? Look at this from the distance of centuries, when the dust of battles has settled and the screams of victims have dissolved in the silence of libraries. Sultan Baibars, Abu al-Futuh, father of conquests. The fourth sultan of a dynasty, he essentially forged himself from blood and iron. We stand before history's most uncomfortable paradox, before a mirror we are afraid to look into. On one hand, we have a monster. Let's call a spade a spade.
Baibars was a usurper.
He killed his friend and master Qutuz, the man who saved him from exile. He killed him basely, with a stab in the back during a handshake. He poisoned dozens of rivals. He slaughtered entire garrisons, breaking his word of honor. He sold women and children into slavery by the thousands, without blinking an eye. If such a man lived today, he would be in a maximum security prison or the Hague Tribunal. His psychological profile is a textbook on clinical sociopathy, lack of empathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism. But, on the other hand, if not for this sociopath, the map of the world today would look completely different. And perhaps there would be no place on it for Egyptian culture, nor the Islamic Renaissance, nor many of us. Imagine for a second an alternative reality, one where Baibars remained just a good general, where he didn't dare murder, where his morality outweighed his ambitions. What would have happened to Egypt?
Qutuz's weak heirs would likely have torn each other apart for power. The Mongols, who understood only the language of force, would have returned. And this time, no one would have stopped them. Cairo would have turned into a second Baghdad. The pyramids would have become observation towers for steppe sentries. The Nile would have turned red with blood, like the Tigris. Islamic civilization, squeezed between crusaders from the sea and Mongols from the land, could have simply disappeared, dissolved, become a footnote in a history textbook, like the Hittites or Assyrians. Baibars became that necessary evil. He was the immune reaction of a dying civilization organism. When a body is attacked by a deadly virus, it produces white blood cells, killer cells. They don't negotiate, they destroy the threat. Baibars was such a white blood cell. Cruel, effective, ruthless. Look at his legacy. The Mamluk Empire, whose foundation he poured with the concrete of fear and discipline, stood for 250 years, a quarter of a millennium. While Europe burned in the 100 Years' War, while dynasties replaced each other in chaos, Egypt remained a medieval superpower. The Mamluks became the guardians of Mecca and Medina. They built architectural masterpieces that stand to this day. They preserved knowledge, trade, art. And the Crusaders? Those knights who tormented the Middle East for 200 years, considering it their property? Baibars kicked them out forever. He didn't just defeat them in battle. He broke their will. He destroyed their castles so that rebuilding them became pointless. After Baibars, the era of the Crusades ended. Europe realized the gates to the east are closed, and a beast stands guard that is better left unwoken. He did what even the great Saladin failed to do. Saladin was a noble knight. He spared enemies, and they returned. Baibars was a butcher. He destroyed enemies, and they disappeared. Brutal arithmetic of survival. Sometimes mercy is a weakness that costs millions of lives in the future. And here is the main question I want to throw in your face. Are you ready to condemn him? Sitting in the comfort of the 21st century, it is easy to discuss humanism. It is easy to say the end doesn't justify the means. But tell that to the citizens of 13th century Cairo, who expected their children to be impaled on Mongol pikes. To them, Baibars was not a tyrant. To them, he was a shield. The only wall between their fragile lives and the absolute abyss. They forgave him everything. They forgave him taxes, executions, fear, because he gave them the most important thing, the right to wake up tomorrow morning. In Cairo, on the Qasr al-Nil bridge, bronze lions still stand. This is Baibars' symbol, the lion, the king of beasts who devours the weak but protects his pride. His history teaches us a terrible truth. Civilization is a thin film over chaos, and to keep this film from tearing, sometimes not saints in white robes are required, but monsters with bloody hands. Baibars died in agony, drinking his own poison. Perhaps it was justice, but if you ask history if it regrets his existence, the answer will be unequivocal. No. The Sultan's throne always stands on the fresh grave of a predecessor, but the foundation of civilization is sometimes mixed with the blood of a tyrant. Ultimately, victors are not judged. They are feared. They are hated. And monuments are built to them. Sultan Baibars, the slave who became master of the world, the killer who became a savior, proved a simple theorem. To defeat the devil, you must become a bit of a devil yourself. And now, turn off this screen. Look out the window. The world you see is calm. But remember, this peace is paid for by someone's cruelty in the distant past. And somewhere in the shadows of history, always stands a silent guardian with a curved saber, ready to do the dirty work again if darkness decides to return.